Good afternoon and happy Sabbath. Our God is an awesome God. We knew that already, but I'm going to tell you a story, in fact, a series of stories that will just reinforce this all the more. So my sermon today is actually a story. It's a story about me. In fact, it's several stories, and the stories might seem unconnected at first. However, they will all converge eventually. God will be glorified, and Patricia features in this story too. And there's going to be a big surprise within this story. After I've told the stories and revealed the surprise, I will attempt to balance two Bible verses that apparently conflict, but they actually don't. So stay tuned and hear how God has been working in my life. Instead of taking each strand of the story chronologically and going towards the conclusion each time, I'll weave each strand around the others in a way that won't necessarily be obvious until you see the finished article. So bear with me. Sometimes it's going to feel as though I'm going off at a tangent, but trust me, everything will connect in the end. And because it's about God's involvement, it will connect very elegantly. So, a bit about me. I work for the probation service. I'm based in Maidstone and I'm a community service supervisor. That means I take people out and organise them while they're doing their community service tasks. I'm outside all day long, all year round, and in summer, that's lovely. It's how I get my suntan. But in winter, it's not so nice. And I also spend some time in a workshop, which can get very cold in winter. In autumn last year, I started to get a nasty cough. It wouldn't go away. Antibiotics wouldn't shift it. I was getting VIP treatment at my local GP surgery. I even managed to get same-day appointments through one of the busiest winters they've ever known. They asked me, have I ever smoked or worked with asbestos? They checked me over and they sent me to the hospital for various tests. No one could figure out what the problem was. I wasn't looking well. I was feeling very tired all the time, and Patricia was getting really worried. Now, she's a member of an online community called Iron Sharpens Iron, and she asked them to pray for me. I can see some of you from that group are even here today. And you need to know that your prayers were answered and in an amazing way that you could never have expected. My cough was getting steadily worse until I ended up having to go off sick in early January this year. I was off work for nearly 2 weeks. I wasn't really ready to come back to work, but in late January, I went back to work anyway. I was back at work for a week and then something major happened. You won't see the significance of this now, and I didn't see the significance of it at the time. I'd taken my work group to a council allotment on the outskirts of Maidstone. Our task was to clear it up so that it was ready to be re-let, and as the adjoining plot was on a higher level, we needed to build a retaining wall at that boundary. We created several staggered layers of stacked car tyres filled with soil, and then we interlocked them and reinforced it by banging some metal rods through the interlocks. The team did really well. It was a productive and uneventful day until we were just about to leave. As I drove the minibus out of the gates with my team on board, several unmarked police cars appeared out of nowhere. They boxed me in, and about 8 plainclothes police officers got out of the cars and converged on the van with tasers at the ready. They arrested one of my passengers. He was a wanted man who'd obviously been up to something serious. I've been doing the job about 10 years and I've never had an experience like that before. I found it traumatic and very unpleasant. And so I promptly went off sick again, this time for work-related stress. I was going to end up off sick for this incident for about 6 weeks. And it was an unpleasant incident, but what it did very successfully was to muddy the waters. The cough was still there, and I was still unwell. However, it's now going to be impossible to separate the effects of the incident and the pre-existing cough. Over those 6 weeks off, the cough disappeared as mysteriously as it had arrived. 6 weeks off work at my employer's expense gave me chance to recover properly and without getting entangled in any attendance management policies. So that man did me a favour, but it didn't stop there. Because of the circumstances of the arrest, I was concerned that I was going to be implicated. It could very easily look as though I'd been colluding with the police that afternoon to help them plan the arrest, and that worried me greatly. I had nothing to do with it, but it wasn't going to look that way. The man who was arrested was a high-risk offender who had a long list of pre-convictions. I'm not going to go into details here, but you certainly wouldn't want him believing that you were somehow involved in planning his arrest. Being off sick gave me time to think. I did wonder if I was going to be able to continue working in the Maidstone area on my return to work because of the risk of reprisals. I'm going to pause that story now, but we're going to come back to it later. I'm going to start another story that goes back decades. In the mid-1990s, my parents sold their house in Greenford in West London, and they moved to Poole. My father had just taken early retirement, and he no longer needed to live within easy reach of Heathrow Airport and of central London. My parents already had many friends who had settled in the Bournemouth and Poole area, so it was a natural area for them to gravitate towards. My parents were much younger then. In fact, they were younger when they moved than I am now. They were still very fit and healthy, and they settled happily in Broadstone, which is a very pleasant suburb on the outskirts of Poole. I have two sisters. One of them has lived in the West Country for many years. She now lives in Salisbury. She's a wise lady, and she's been very supportive towards my parents as they got older. But she's got various challenges and health problems of her own, and there are limits to what she is able to do. My other sister lived in Haywards Heath, near Gatwick, and then about 4 years ago, her and her husband moved to Clevedon in North Somerset. So quite independently, much of the family, although me and my sisters grew up in London, many of them have moved west. And this left Patricia and I as the only family members of our generation or older still living in the southeast. As far as Patricia's family are concerned, well, almost all of them live in the USA or Barbados, so on that count, it would make no difference where in the UK we would move to. Time moves on. As my parents reached their mid-80s, it was becoming obvious that they were struggling to cope. Patricia and I were making ever more frequent journeys from Kent to Poole to resolve various problems and emergencies. It had crossed my mind that it would be a good idea for us to move westwards so that we could be closer to my parents, but it was far from obvious how this was going to be achieved. However, both Patricia and I had a working pattern that included a synchronized 3-day weekend, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. As we both had the same jobs, we could synchronize. Patricia was based in Tunbridge Wells, and I at the time was based in Chatham. We thought for the moment that we could manage the situation with my parents just by using our weekends. A few years ago, our jobs changed slightly. I transferred to the Maidstone depot, and Patricia stayed with the same employer, but secured a Maidstone-based role as a probation service officer. And our Kent, Surrey and Sussex-based employer became amalgamated into the National Probation Service, covering all of England and Wales. Back to my parents. By 2022, my father was becoming less mobile and his health problems were getting worse. My mother was having great difficulty adapting to Dad's changing needs. She was getting very stressed and her short-term memory was getting worse. Their needs were increasing and we felt to be a long way from Poole. We have to use the M25 and the M3 and the M27 to get there. These roads are always busy, and the M25 in particular is often unpredictable with an ever-present possibility of serious delays. Getting from Kent to Dorset really can be a mission. My father struggled past his 91st birthday, then he got past the next milestone of Christmas 2024. And then in early 2025, he died. This came as no surprise to us. My employer was very understanding, and Patricia and I got 2 weeks of compassionate leave so that we could be in Poole with Mum and sort out the many administrative and practical implications. My mother remains in her house. She loves it there, but it's a large, older house with a huge garden. It's full of trip hazards, it's expensive to maintain, and it's really not suitable for an elderly person. We suggested that she might like to move to a sheltered housing block in Clevedon, near one of my sisters, but this idea was rejected out of hand. So here we were, this is late 2025, my mother in a situation where she won't move, but needs support, and we're a long way away, and there's still no obvious route for us to move any closer to her. Mum isn't the only reason we wanted to move westwards. Apart from us and 2 of my nephews who remain in or near London, everyone else in the family is either in Dorset, Wiltshire, Somerset, or Bristol. The other 3 of my nieces and nephews have settled in those counties too. As we get older, we'll want to be closer to them. I wondered if I should wait until I retire before moving, as that would remove the biggest complication of us both getting a job in the area, but without having to take a pay cut or change employer. I didn't feel ready to make such a significant move, but by the time I am ready, it's going to be too late. How do I solve a problem like that? It feels like trying to square a circle. Back we go to February 2026 and the incident that I had at work. I genuinely thought that I'm going to need to relocate from Kent for my own safety. I talked this over with my manager. In fact, those concerns were baseless. However, at the time, I wasn't to know this. My man, the man who'd got arrested, he'd been located by the police in real time via his mobile phone. And actually, it seemed as though he was half expecting to get arrested sometime that afternoon. I have a very good manager. He's well aware of the situation with my mother. And because I'd already expressed a desire to relocate from Kent, we started to discuss the possibility of a compassionate transfer to Dorset. Because we were working for a national organisation, this was now an option where it hadn't been an option a few years previously. Patricia would also need to submit an application for a compassionate transfer. My manager didn't want to build my hopes up, and he advised me that transfers with a family-based rationale can take a very long time to arrange and implement. Anyway, he said, just put in a joint application. It will go to the staffing committees of the sending and receiving areas, and we'll see what happens. So here's where the various stories begin to converge, and it's where God's hand becomes ever more obvious. It had been there all along, of course, but it really becomes obvious from now on. I'd said to Patricia on various occasions in the past that it would be great to move to Wiltshire or Dorset, but how can this ever happen? We would have to synchronise 2 job moves and a house move, and then have the funds to actually follow it through. That's impossible, or so I thought. I thought the hardest bit was going to be getting the job moves arranged. Well, it wasn't hard at all because God was in charge. The compassionate transfer applications were both approved within weeks. I don't think anyone has ever known it to happen so fast. My job is transferring to Dorchester. Patricia has got a transfer to Weymouth. With our respective current and prospective managers, we agreed start dates of the 1st September this year. Yep, you heard that right. That's in just over 2 weeks' time. When we had initially had thoughts of moving to the southwest of the country, Patricia contacted the court team and was informed that there were only vacancies in Poole, which would not have worked for us because God was pointing us towards the Dorchester area where I will be based, and which is the central area in terms of getting to my mother and my sisters. In the interim, Patricia then decided to move from the court team in Kent, mainly based at Sevenoaks, to the sentence management unit in Kent, based in Maidstone, to get some experience. As she thought, as there's always staff shortages within most sentence management units in England, she'd benefit from some SMU experience and reap a possible job transfer. Now, some might say that Patricia was trying to, quote, assist God, and I couldn't possibly comment. In any event, SMU experience makes the court processes understandable and vice versa. Having some certainty around dates and locations meant that by the end of April, we could seriously begin looking for somewhere to live. We rent currently in Kent, and we still intend to rent when we get to Dorset. For a number of reasons, securing a rental tenancy is much harder now than it was a few years ago. There are fewer places available, and there is more competition for each one. In May and June, we went off to Dorset, house hunting. We saw several places that had potential, but there were compromises with each one. Whenever we saw a place we liked, we gave our proposed move-in date of late August, but then the landlord offered the tenancy to someone else who was in a position to move sooner. We were too early for some places and too late for others. In mid-June, Patricia saw an advert for a house near Dorchester that certainly seemed suitable. On Friday the 19th of June, we viewed it and we liked it. On Monday the 22nd of June, we'd agreed a move-in date. Our referencing took only a day. By Thursday the 25th of June, we'd paid a holding deposit, and a short time later, we paid the balance. And that was it, sewn up within a week. Consider Revelation 3, verse 8. I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Once we'd committed ourselves to this place, we once more began to see adverts for the properties we'd viewed previously, but which were offered to people who were in a position to move in sooner. They weren't available to us when we would have taken them, but as soon as we couldn't take them, they became available once again. Meanwhile, the place we had committed ourselves to became ours without the slightest delay or hitch. That was absolutely God directing our paths. Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. And this place that we're moving to is actually the one we liked best. In no way is it a consolation prize or a second best option. It's as good as the place we are leaving. Different, but just as good. We currently live on a farm where many of the buildings have been converted to residential use and rented out, and we're surrounded by lovely countryside. And we're moving to somewhere very similar, the only difference being that we're now going to be the youngest residents on the complex, not one of the oldest residents as we are now. Quite literally, I walk to the end of the back garden of the new house, and then I'm on a footpath that takes me through miles of beautiful open country. Would God give you second best? Of course he wouldn't. Matthew 7, verses 9 to 11. Of what man is there of you whom, if his son ask bread, will he give him a stone? Or if he ask a fish, will he give him a serpent? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask him? So the jobs are sorted out, the house is found, dates are agreed, we're ready to roll. But hang on, what about all the administrative and removal costs involved with moving? We're having to run our old and new places concurrently for a month. We've had to pay a substantial security deposit for the new place before we're going to get the security deposit back from our old place. We'll need to pay for the physical removal of all of our things from Kent to Dorset. And that's a lot of stuff, and it's a 350-mile round trip. We'll need to replace some of our furniture. That's going to soak up several £1,000s, money we don't have spare. In mid-May, we didn't have it. 6 weeks later, we did. We had every penny we needed without needing to sell, ask, or borrow. Was that just a bit of good luck? Of course not. Once more, God's hand was in this, leading in a clear and unmistakable way. Consider Isaiah 30, verse 21. And thine ears shall hear a word behind thee, saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, when ye turn to the right hand and when ye turn to the left. And also consider Proverbs 16, verse 9. A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. And there's more icing to go onto this cake, so to speak. We'd expected we'd have to get a washing machine and fridge freezer for wherever we moved to. The ones we've got in Kent are supplied with a property, and we'll have to leave them behind. Well, it turned out that the house we're moving to had these appliances already there. They belonged to the person who previously owned the house, and which his son and nephew, who inherited them, they're the landlords, they weren't in a position to remove these items easily. So they gave them to us, not sold, they gave them to us. If they go wrong, it's our problem, not theirs, but I can live with that. I fitted a new door seal to the freezer, and it's as good as new. The washing machine works fine as well, and that saved us several £100s. Philippians 4 verse 19 states, But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus. And he did. And yes, there's yet more icing to go on the cake. When Patricia received confirmation of her compassionate transfer in June, and that the vacancy was in Weymouth court team, God's hand in the process was made clear. Poole courts were now closed for renovation for 6 months, and all of the cases were transferred to Weymouth, which is nearer to where God has found us that lovely house to live in the pretty village of Cerne Abbas. Furthermore, on the days Patricia is asked to go to Poole courts, probation will pay her travel and expenses. I told you at the very beginning that I had a surprise for you. You've probably worked out by now what the surprise is, but just in case you haven't, let me spell it out. In less than 2 weeks, we will be leaving Kent, moving far away from London and relocating to a pretty little village in rural Dorset, just a few miles from the historic county town of Dorchester. This means that today will be our final Sabbath at Riverway. Pastor Jeff asked me if I could be available to preach today. He asked me on the 5th of June. He didn't know our situation, and this was also several weeks before we knew we had anywhere to live in our new area. I couldn't have preached this sermon here any later than today, and various family and practical commitments meant I couldn't have been available to do it for much of July and August. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. God's timing and geography are impeccable. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God's guidance to us has been very clear, but that doesn't mean we should be passive. Having faith alone is all very well, but it has to be combined with actions. We don't just sit and wait for an unseen force to mysteriously push us somewhere, or sit and wait to hear the voice of God telling us what to do next. We actually have to do something to give the guidance a chance to happen. Consider our scripture reading today. Faith without works is dead. And what about that workplace incident that triggered me going off sick for 6 weeks? It was something I didn't welcome at the time, but it was the very thing that triggered this entire move. It wasn't nice, but a lot of good has come of it. Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. When Patricia and I got married nearly 21 years ago, living in the southwest of England was far away and well over the horizon. But in fact, the framework was being quietly put into place many years previously. Moving away from Kent was a possibility that hadn't even crossed our minds until much later. And even when it did cross our minds, it seemed impossible. Matthew 19, verse 26. But Jesus beheld them and said unto them, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And so now on to what might appear to be an inconsistency. This story raises an interesting question, which I'm sure is one many of you will have asked yourselves in the past. Maybe you've been asking yourself this question recently. We've all come across the verse from Psalms 46:10, telling us to be still and know that I am God. In the original Hebrew, be still can mean to let go, drop our hands, or cease striving. It is a gentle reminder to surrender our burdens, release the need to control everything, and trust that God is in complete control. But herein lies the essential question. When do you stay still and when do you move? How does one reconcile that verse with the one from James 2, faith without works is dead? My opinion is that it's about knowing what the works should be and balancing those with giving up control to God. We can push at a door and see if it opens. But instead of pushing gently at the door, do we actually kick it hard? And when God tries to shut the door, do we put our foot in the way to stop it shutting? We shouldn't do either of those things, but we're human, and sometimes we can't help ourselves. Fortunately, Acts 17, verse 30 tells us that God winks at our ignorance. And that verse addresses how divine grace interacts with humanity's lack of knowledge or spiritual understanding. Above all, we have to pray our way through the uncertainty and allow God to direct our paths rather than us trying to direct God along our preferred path. Patricia and I have prayed repeatedly about our move, both before and during. And so it all depends on the attitude with which you approach it. If you approach these seemingly conflicting instructions as inconsistency, then that's how they will remain. However, if you try to work with them rather than against them, it should all fall into place. Pray to God and ask for understanding and guidance about concepts that, when combined, can be beyond human understanding. And if you do that, guidance is what you will get. We will miss Kent. It's been my home county since 1988. Other than a few years in the East Midlands in my late teens and early 20s, I've never lived outside London or the London commuter belt. This is a big move for me, both geographically and culturally. But everyone I talk to says that I will never look back once I'm there. It's the right move at the right time, and it makes sense for so many reasons. Patricia and I will be able to make more frequent visits to my mother, and as she gets older and frailer, she will need this more and more. We will appreciate more time with her, as she is 92 now, and she knows that she can't have much time left. We will be able to settle in a new area while we're still young and fit enough to enjoy and appreciate it. And as me and my siblings get older, we will be closer to each other. We thought about moving on several occasions over the past 5 years, but the time or the place never seemed right. But it certainly feels like the right time now, so off we go. This wasn't a case of us just aimlessly drifting wherever the winds and currents of happenstance took us. God's fingerprints are all over this move, and it was meant to happen. We certainly could not have done this by ourselves. God has done more, far more than we could ever have imagined. I'm going to close this sermon with Ephesians 3, verse 20. Now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. Because that's what God has done.